Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out in such large numbers at this time of day. I know I'm in Trinidad and Tobago when this happens, because the name of this morning's exercise is Mind Your Business. And I knew once that was the title of this exercise that quite a few of you would be here, because you, if you're not minding your business, you're minding somebody else's business. But serious, this exercise is a unique one. Haven't been done before, and it's really about minding your business. It's a situation where, as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, having been in office for 3 years, 3 very difficult years, I'm here to ground with you your foundation about your business. Because in this country, everybody could tell you about your business, but I want you to know your business, so that when anybody talks to you, whether it is from the government, the opposition, the media, the neighbor, you would know how to take what you're being told, because you would have minded your business. Today is the first time I'm talking to citizens for 2019, so permit me to welcome you with a wish for all the best for 2019. Wish you good health, I wish you safety, I wish you prosperity and growth for you and your family. And this is as good a time as any for us to make an assessment of where we've been, where we come from, where we are, and where we're going in the next few months, few years. Because if we don't make that assessment, we might throw the baby out with the bathwater, encouraged by some who want the bathtub and the baby. Or we might not make the difficult adjustments that are required. Or we might behave in an irresponsible manner and miss the adjustments or the opportunities that might come our way. So what I propose to do today is to talk to you, and we're taping these proceedings so you're on television today. And you will be when we broadcast this to the national community, because as I talk to you, the intention is to take this conversation and this presentation to the national community, so that everybody in this country will have an opportunity to know what our business is and to have the opportunity to mind their business. And then be able to appreciate what we have done, what we are doing, what we intend to do, and the reasons for the decisions that we've made, as well as the ones that we have to make. And of course, to be able to say whether we are doing as well as we are able to do, or whether we are, in fact, squandering our opportunities. We don't live in this world alone. There are lots of other people in our circumstances, and this morning we'll do some comparisons to see where we are vis-a-vis other people who have similar situations. So that being so, let me once again say welcome to this exercise, and I hope you leave here, at whatever time we leave, better informed, better educated, more knowledgeable of your own situation and your children's future. Because I'm speaking to you today, not only as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, but as the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, responsible for your business. And you will be the judge of where you are, where we are, what we're doing, and where we're going. So without further ado, I want to take you onto the screen. And for the next half an hour, 40 minutes, we would use this screen to demonstrate what I want to talk to you about. At the top of the screen, it says, what happened? Something happened in Trinidad and Tobago. And before I go there, I must tell you, very few of you in here would argue with me if I say to you that our circumstance, our well-being, quality of our life, our expenditure, our revenues are largely influenced and based on the fortunes that come out of the hydrocarbon sector, oil and gas. And what this slide does, when it asks you what happened, it asks you to look at this red tab here. These are our earnings, that red bar. 2014, we were earning $17 billion. And I'm going to emphasize billion as against million, where a billion is 1,000 million. 2014, earnings from the energy sector as the major contributor to our national revenues was $17 billion. By 2016, it was $1 billion. Yeah, that's before you. Look at the red, compare the reds. 17 in 2014, 1 in 2016. And the question is, what happened? 3 things happened starting in 2014 for that to have occurred. See that little black line there going down to 1 billion? 3 things happened over here. Look at the blue. The top thing that happened is something that we had no control over. It was the collapse of the oil and gas price. Oil prices prior to 2014 were leveling up here at over $90 a barrel. And gas was $4.30 a unit. The world economic changes pointed downwards, influencing those prices downwards. Oil price was collapsing, gas price was collapsing. Oil collapsed from $93 down to $47 when the government changed in 2015. And it continued to collapse down to $28 a barrel. And that is what, but that is only the gas and oil price influence on this loss of revenue. The other loss of revenue was internal to us here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll show you later in a slide, where our oil production had been falling consistently over the years. And so therefore the loss of volume, our oil production was down 10% and our gas production was down 20%. So at the same time you had a collapse in gas price, a collapse in oil price. You were having a collapse, a continued collapse in oil volume and a collapse in gas volume. And a third thing that happened that resulted in this loss of revenue is a decision made by the government of Trinidad and Tobago in 2013-2014. And that decision was, facing a loss of gas production, the government thought it was wise to give concessions to the gas companies to encourage them to produce more gas, to give them concessions. And that concession was, whatever you invest in looking for gas, you can write off against your taxes immediately and totally. So if you spent $100 million on a well looking for gas, you can immediately write that off from your taxes. What that did is that whatever taxes we were getting and were liable to get going forward, even in a difficult situation, we gave that up in those concessions. So those 3 things, price collapse, volume collapse, and the concessions, resulted in a loss of revenue of $16 billion. And the government changed right here in 2015, the end of 2015. I became your prime minister on September 9th. September 9th, 2015, I was sworn in. This is what I met. And of course, we had a structural arrangement in this country as to how we get revenue from the energy sector. Just look at this graph. Green there is revenue. This one, Nigeria. This one is Trinidad and Tobago. In Nigeria, that company that operates here in Trinidad and Tobago that shall remain nameless had revenues of $6.8 billion in Nigeria. But the tax arrangement in Nigeria was such that they had to pay the Nigerians 53% of that in taxes. So the Nigerians got $3.6 billion in taxes from revenues of $6.8 billion. The company kept the rest as their profit. But the Nigerians got that. While Trinidad and Tobago is not as large as Nigeria, we're quite large, almost there, 1.5 billion less. But we got less than 1% in taxes. So while the Nigerians got over $3 billion in taxes, we got 31 million in taxes. And that is the environment in which some of our people here are telling us that we need to give incentives, make it more attractive to the oil companies, otherwise they would leave and go. But we in this government, we know who our shareholders are. They know who their shareholders are. And will probably even ask for more incentives. We know who our shareholders are. You are our shareholders, and this is not acceptable. And that is why last year we had this, what we call the energy spotlight at the Hyatt, where we addressed this issue, and we said to the country that we are not prepared to accept this. Even though we have contractual arrangements, we are going to open discussions with the oil companies to discuss this matter, where we are not getting a fair share from the resources that we are selling. Those discussions have been opened. We've got some progress so far. We've had some agreements so far, and they continue in some areas. But the government of Trinidad and Tobago, this government, unlike any other, has engaged this issue. But that is just for comparison. Hydrocarbon production, this is oil and gas. The line at the top is the gas production, going back to 2010. And if you notice, it's pretty level on top here, over 4 billion, all the way out here to 2015, where it fell to 3.8. But the curve is literally going downwards like that. And by the time you got to 2016, we were producing just over 3 BCF of gas per day. But the curve shows you what has happened, and by 2017, we were in a trough here. That is the collapse of the gas price, the gas volume. Of course, the price collapsed with that too. Now, if you look at the blue bars, that's the oil production. Those are bars representing how much oil we produce each year, and as you observe, each year was less and less, going way back out here. By the time we are where we are down here in 2018, and going forward, we were getting into dangerously low volumes. So sometimes the price is going up, but we're not benefiting because we're not producing oil to take advantage of the price. We've got to improve on the volume. So if the price is high and you have nothing to sell, it doesn't help you. If your volume is high and the price is low, you still get a fair amount of money. But if your volume is low and the price is low, then trouble. So those are our history with respect to this decade in oil in the blue and gas up there in that line. Now, our gross domestic product. This is the performance of the country's economy over time based on its response to these changes in the oil and gas business. And the green line represents how the economy had been responding. Over here, where the gross domestic product is the amount of goods and services provided in the country. Over. If things are good, a lot of goods and services, a lot of things happening, and the economy is booming. But 2011, you see the graph is going up. 2012 is going up. 2013 is going up. Those 3 years, 2011, 2012, and 2013, when the graph is doing that, were 3 of the largest expenditure years in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Because up to 2010, we were spending about $43 billion a year as our national budget. The government changed in 2010 and went on a spending spree. We moved the economy up to $50 billion in expenditure. Then 52. Then it got up to 60 billion. But then in 2014, trouble, because the oil and gas price collapsed. And the graph shows it here, nosedive into that trough, 2014. Trouble, election is 2015. The government could not allow this graph to continue in that direction for the general election of 2015. So even though the price had collapsed, as I told you, in oil, the price collapsed in gas, the government took a decision to spike the expenditure up to that. That's 2015. That peak you see there, that's 2015. That's the general election spending. We'll come to that in a little while. But having done that, the result of that in 2016, that couldn't be sustained. That was purely for the election. It could not be sustained. But it shows up here as good performance of the economy on that peak. But as soon as the election was over, doesn't matter who was in office, nosedive into this trough. And that was my lot, to lead a government in this trough. And I knew since I was a little boy, if you're in a hole the first thing you have to start doing is to stop digging and try and make your way out. That's what we have been doing. And how have we done that? First thing we did was to reduce the size of the government, discretionary expenses. The cabinet that I lead is running at $50 billion cheaper, $50 million cheaper, because we have 10 ministers less in this government. The last government had 32 ministers or 33 ministers. This government has 23. And the cost of those ministers, 10 more ministers, was $50 million a year. Over 5 years, that is $250 million just by doing that. So we cut out waste. We cut out corruption. And we made decisions to increase revenue. Because you have to increase the revenue, because remember, you were servicing the country at a very high level to maintain a certain standard of living. We couldn't just, notwithstanding the advice we got from some, we couldn't just say 2 and 2 make 4 and that's the economy. If we had cut out $20 million from the economy to bring it down from 60 to 40 billion, what would have happened to the people who were living off that 20 billion? So we have to do it over time, slowly and carefully, maintaining stability in the economy, maintaining a fair amount of jobs, and trying everywhere we're able to increase revenue to get out of this hole. By 2017, we were here. And by 2018, we are there. And the IMF and the Ministry of Finance predicting that if we maintain the same level of proficiency and good governance that we are maintaining, we could do a 2% growth on the economy. That's that dashed line. And if we maintain that, we would be above where we were here. And we would be stable with a future that holds out hope for good quality of life in the country. That's where we're at now. And you see the projections for 2019 and 2020, the dashed white line, that is where we're aiming to go. This is where we've come from. And let nobody in this country tell you otherwise. The one thing I could tell you, this is without fear of contradiction, because these are your numbers. Fiscal operations, deficit, and energy revenue. The blue bar is the revenue. That's the money coming into the country. The gold bar is the money you're spending. Between 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, every year you will see the gold bar is higher than the blue bar. Meaning that even though oil prices were up at $90 and we were getting $17 billion and more a year in some years, the government of the day was spending more than we earn in every single year. But to do that, you had to borrow. The only way you could spend more than you earn is borrow. So even though you were spending all of the high revenues, we were still borrowing. Those red marks down here were borrowings. Deficit, we call that. Borrow, 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 borrow to be able to spend at that level. We're being advised now by them how to run the country. But the easiest thing to have done then to run the country and keep us on an even keel for the rainy day was to spend within that blue line. But no, we are borrowing, and that's how we got the record budgets of 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. The 5 largest budgets in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Spend all that you earn, borrow more, and spend that too. And then, of course, by the time we got here to 2015, where the elections came about, see how the gas line is dropping down into there? Revenues. By the time we got there, see what the borrowing is in 2015? But what you don't know, I should tell you that now. You see how the borrowing has become less than 2015? That was the election year. The borrowing, how do you compare? How do you explain the small amount of borrowing here and the peak I showed you? Remember I showed you a peak for 2015? How do you explain that? This was not the true borrowing. Secret borrowings were being done. And we'll get to that later on. But of course, we came into office and immediately, see the red bar here? That is the real borrowing that we had to borrow to maintain the economy. We had to prevent the economy from collapsing. We had to pay public servants. We had to pay nurses. We had to buy medicine for the hospital. Had to pay the public debt. Had to pay all the bills that the country has to pay. But the money was not there. So we had to borrow, and we borrowed. And by 2017, record borrowings down here. And who was complaining about the borrowings that we were doing? Who was pointing out that the government was borrowing? And who was warning us about debt? But if you observe, as we took the reins of the country here at the end of 2015, we borrowed there. We went into 2017, large borrowings there. But look at the years going forward. We didn't continue to borrow on that scale because we were having to reduce our expenditure. We were mindful of the borrowings that we were doing. And you notice the two bars here, 2018 and the projection for 2019 going in the right direction, that we are reducing the amount of money we're borrowing. Not because we don't want to spend, but because we want to bring the economy to a situation of stability where we can, year after year, have a stable economy upon which to work for economic growth, because it is economic growth that will give us the revenues to keep us at expenditure levels to maintain the quality of life that you had become accustomed to. Now, every one of you in here, I don't see any school children in here, I see only adults. Every one of you in here belong to a household. And most of you are responsible. I see all the ladies in here. I know you are responsible for what goes on in the household in terms of making ends meet. Because you're not the ones who go and drink for their partner and make sure the children get fed, and even that there's gas in the car. Let's look at the household is very much like the country. It's the same principle. You earn revenue, which is the black quantum, and you spend, which is the red quantum. And the hatched area at the top, sometimes you borrow to keep your spending going. You might even have a mortgage. You might be funding a child in school, and you're borrowing to do those things. And of course, some of these gentlemen are borrowing and spending to do other things that you don't want them to do. Right? But revenue and expenditure. In 2015, and just remember, I took charge of the affairs of this country as head of a government after an election in 2015, September. The budget, the first thing this government had to do was to bring a budget. Remember that? Got election September 7th, that is budget month. October 1st, the new budget starts. So we had a new budget period 3 weeks after we became the government of Trinidad and Tobago. This is the household of expenditure, Trinidad and Tobago House. $4.75 billion a month was required to run the country. $4.75 billion a month. To do that, we had now, you are borrowing $250 million a month. So the wonderful conditions that were left, and you listen to some of them, and one of them was on TV this morning telling me what a horrible state the country is in and how incompetent the government is and la 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 la. To maintain whatever existed at the end of 2015, you had to have $4.75 billion per month. You had to spend everything you earned, and you had to borrow $250 million a month going forward. The new government could not continue in that way. Like it, but the matter is not who you vote for or where you live in this country. The country of Trinidad and Tobago could not continue like that. Otherwise, we would end up in bankruptcy. The same way if you in your household earning $4,750 a month and you spend like that, if you don't curb it, it's only a matter of time before you end up in a situation where you lose your family, you lose your whatever, because you're going to go bankrupt. This new government of 2015 had to avoid that on your behalf. That is the job you gave me. So we had to shrink the size of the expenditure. We brought it down the projections now for 2019 is that we would be aiming to spend $4 billion a month. That is $750 million less in revenues coming in. But we need to spend more than that because we have things that we have to do to maintain the country at a certain level. But look at the revenue we're projecting. It's $750 million less per month than you were having in 2015. So in other words, there's less money available. And of course, to have a budget, an expenditure of $4.3 billion, right, we need to borrow $300 million. So we're still in the borrowing business. But we have shrunk it to a manageable situation, and the whole objective is to bring borrowing and spending and revenue in sync, that it can be sustained. So you keep your eyes on your revenue, keep your expenditure close to your revenue, and you do some borrowing. And you can maintain that going forward. This is a very interesting slide. We call it just two accounts. Come back over here on this line. $20 billion in cash. The country owns the National Gas Company, which is the pipeline company handling all the gas in the country, most of the gas, 90-odd%. And we make money from handling that gas. And the NGC in 2010, and keep your calendar in your mind straight, at the changeover of government in 2010, there was $16 billion, $14 billion, $14 billion in cash at the NGC. The government account at the central bank had $6 billion in cash. That is 14 and 6, that is 20. By the end of 2015, those accounts were NGC 14 billion gone, the 6 billion in the central bank gone, that is the cash gone, and an overdraft of 9 billion spent at the central bank. So 14 plus 6 plus 9, that is $29 billion of cash that was burnt up in that period. And that is not, this is not the total revenue, this is just the revenue that was involved in straight cash. It wasn't revenue for the year coming in and expenditure for the year. This was reserve cash. What used to happen before is that every year, the Minister of Finance, in making up the national budget, will take a dividend from NGC of approximately 200 up to about $300 or $400 million in a dividend. Because it's a government company, you have cash in there, it pays the Minister of Finance a dividend. That dividend will be factored into the national budget. Never before did a government go into the NGC and just spend out all the money in the NGC. In fact, in the last year of the UNC, the election year, they went into the NGC 4 times. And after 4 raids, none was left. And they were at the central bank, running up the overdraft right up to the limit. And that is why Minister Imbert, the new Minister of Finance, could have told this country without contradiction that within a week of being Minister of Finance, he had a visit from the governor of the central bank who came to him smiling before he became an opposition senator. Before he became an opposition senator, the governor of the central bank came to the new Minister of Finance smiling to advise him that we only have cash to run the country for 3 days. So when you're minding your business and you hear anybody telling you how wonderfully well they ran the country and they left the country in such good shape, and the Rowley government and the Rowley government and the Rowley government, it didn't have no Rowley government, it's the government of Trinidad and Tobago. I appointed a Minister of Finance, and his job was to hold this country together. We only had money to run the country for 3 days. And of course, if I come back here, I wanted to tell you what $4 billion is. The biggest bank in the region, Commonwealth region here, is our bank, Republic Bank. And one of the biggest banks in this country is FCB. If you take all the profit that Republic Bank makes and all the profit that FCB makes, put it together, that could run the country for 2 weeks. We just created the NIF by putting together huge amounts of shares from Angostura, Whitco, and so on, to raise $4 billion. That will run the country for approximately a month. We met an expenditure rate of $170 million a day. That's what it takes to keep it going. All those who feel that nothing is happening and more should happen, $170 million a day to make sure that nurses get paid, doctors get paid, drugs in the hospital, roads maintained, all those payments, pensions paid. We had to reduce that, and we've reduced it down to $140 million a day. So $30 million of effect. Some jobs would be lost. Some businesses might have to struggle. But we are aiming to do what the revenues allow us to do, and to do it on a sustainable basis. If we had continued trying to spend $170 million a day, we would have bankrupted this country. And it was not the job of the country, the government, to bankrupt the country. It was the opposite. The government in this situation had to ensure that we put the country in a position where we can live, not from day to day or from month to month, but into an indefinite future and give our children a chance. That's what the government has to do. So here, $29 billion was being vacuumed into this garbage truck. Now, I want you, in minding your business, to ask yourself, what do we have to show for the burning up of that cash? After we burn up all that cash, what do we have to show for it? Because we were running the country before and having that cash situation. When the Manning government left the country, we were running the country. We had an election, the Manning government lost the election and new government came in. But why did the country suddenly have to burn up all its cash like that and end up with none? 14 billion there, 6 billion there, and 9 billion. And you know the interesting thing about it? Having done that, when we went to the parliament to raise the borrowing level so that the new government could borrow some money to run the country, we had 18 questions being asked to us. What you borrowing money for? Why you borrowing? Because you see, this is controlled by law. The parliament sets the level of the overdraft. And I can tell you now, sometimes the Minister of Finance, having issued warrants and checks for the departments, will tell a permanent secretary, don't put the checks out yet. Because government checks could bounce. Are you aware of that? Yeah. If you don't believe me, go and ask Coach Charles. Under the Pandy government in Tobago, the government checks bounced in Tobago because there was no money in the THA account. So in managing the country's affairs, one of the things the Minister of Finance has to do on a daily or monthly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, the permanent secretaries in the Ministry of Finance have to make sure that when they write a check for anything, that when that check is presented anywhere, that there's money to cover that check. Otherwise, the government check will bounce. And that is how you manage the affairs of state. So, look at the things that have not been done in Trinidad and Tobago and which now fall to this government to do. And if we had access to this kind of cash or to borrow against it, look what we could have done. We had an earthquake recently. I was about a few hundred yards away from the Port of Spain General Hospital, and I could tell you, as I rode out that earthquake on my bed, at the edge of my bed, I was listening for a loud crashing sound. And when I didn't hear it and the earthquake stopped, I found myself exhaling because I knew that the main tower in the Port of Spain General Hospital was assessed by the engineers in 2009 and was deemed to be engineeringly unsound. So it was my fear that that tower could have collapsed in that magnitude 6.9 earthquake. As God will bless us, it did not. But it got damaged. We have to evacuate it, as we are doing now, and we have to take it down and rebuild it. If we had built that, and that was deemed to be a priority for the government of Trinidad and Tobago in 2009, it is now being addressed. Let us say we spend $2 billion on that. Then, of course, Sangre Grande has to have a new hospital. It's the only part of the country now where an upgrade of the hospital has not taken place. Everywhere else in the country, there's either a good hospital or a new one to be opened soon. Sangre Grande is the last place, the eastern part, from Matla to Sangre Grande to Kumar to Manzanilla. They're going to get a new hospital. That's $850 million. Then, of course, we spoke a while ago about the reduction and loss of our gas-producing potential. One of the things that this government did to deal with that in the medium and long term is to get an arrangement with Venezuela where there is excess gas. Gas aplenty. We are next door, 7 miles away. We have come to the conclusion, and we concluded an arrangement with Venezuela to allow Trinidad and Tobago to access Venezuelan gas for a price, bring it to Trinidad and Tobago to keep our Point Lisas going, but you have to build a pipeline to do that. We're partnering with Shell in that. Shell going to put up some of the money. We might be asked to put up some of the money. We may have to put up, let's say $1 billion in that pipeline to ensure that we have gas to run our economy in Point Lisas. But that's something we have to do if we're going to get the gas. And of course, you hear about diversifying the economy, meaning do other things other than oil and gas, so that when the fortunes of oil and gas change as they have changed in 2014, 2015, that you will have a sound economy elsewhere. Diversify the economy, do other things. One of the things that we're doing is using our geographical location close to the Panama Canal and trying to get built in La Brea an international standard dry dock, so that ships that are traversing the Atlantic to the Pacific through Panama could get serviced in Trinidad and Tobago and create large amounts of jobs and pay us in foreign exchange. That is not oil and gas. That is a service to ships in the Atlantic Ocean. That dry dock may require us getting involved in a $2 billion expenditure. The Chinese are offering to come in with us. They will take up 30%. We have to be good for 70%. But of course, if we had set about doing that, say $2 billion, then of course, we say the area of tourism, whatever the company may be, but tourism, a tourism project in Tobago, a big tourism project in Tobago, big enough to impact on Tobago's economy and Trinidad and Tobago's economy. We don't have that now. Every other Caribbean island has that. We said if we do that in Tobago, make that investment in Tobago, we are diversifying the economy into tourism. So let's say a tourism project in Tobago of $1 billion, whatever the project might be. And of course, Tobago needs a proper airport terminal if you're going to think along the scale of an upgrade in our tourism. As it stands now, if a jumbo jet lands in Tobago and starts to offload or is loading, people are out in the car park trying to get on the plane. And if it's raining, you can't get off the plane into the airport. That is not how you do tourism in 2019. We need a proper airport terminal, and we're doing that now. And let's say that costs another $1 billion. Purchase 2 new ferries for Tobago. For the last 36 months in this country, the conversation, the biggest scandal in my government, according to some people, is the ferry, the ferry, the ferry, the ferry. We had 2 used ferries that were bought by a previous government that were run into the ground in the ocean without maintenance. If you drive your car without maintenance, one day you're going to shut down on the highway. The same people who ran the ferry to Tobago without maintenance, when they lost their certification and had to be forced to be put into dry dock, In fact, one can't even go back into dry dock. The Express is now to be sold as is where is. The same people who did that is now making the ferry the number one issue in the country and call it a scandal. Well, we know that the only solution to that is to buy 2 new ferries. And if we're going to buy 2 new ferries as they're being built right now as I speak to you, let's put aside another $1 billion there. And of course, the San Fernando Waterfront Project is a project that needs to be done so that the southern city, the second largest city in the country with a waterfront, San Fernando is the only waterfront city in the Caribbean or possibly the world where the waterfront is a dump. We are saying that as a country, we could improve San Fernando's economy for the people of San Fernando and the people of Trinidad and Tobago by investing money in a waterfront development in San Fernando. Let's say we start that project with $1 billion. And let's say, with all the guns that you're picking up in the streets in this country, the more you pick up guns, the more they have guns in Trinidad and Tobago. Because we are not able to properly protect our borders. We need 2 vessels that can go out on our south and east coast and around Tobago and prevent those who will harm us with guns and ammunition. So, we're going to invest, as we are doing now, in 2 vessels that can go out there, have the endurance to be out there for 2-3 weeks, and then they come in. We need 2 because when one goes out, the other one comes in. That, let's say, that's costing us $600 million. And of course, we have 100,000 applicants at the HDC for houses. Let's say we spend $2 billion in 3,000 houses. All of that will come to less than half of what they burnt up in the cash that they met. Burnt up $29 billion in cash, and not one of these projects have been attended to. But they have the unmitigated gall to be telling this government and telling you, the people, how good they were, and they must put them back to continue doing this. Well, I speak for the Rowley government. I speak for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm committed to doing this. That is our work program. All of these things. With respect to the Port of Spain Hospital, tenders are out. We are removing the old buildings to clear the footprint. We're moving patients. The cabinet approved some expenditure in St. James to put some patients in St. James Hospital and so on to be able to build. That is on the way. Sandy Grande Hospital, we have quotations in. We are about to go out to tender for that. Dragon Pipeline, the heads of government agreement is in place, the gas price is in place. It is now for us to conclude the pipeline arrangement with Shell and to move forward to constructing a pipeline to link us to the Venezuelan gas fields. The La Brea dry dock, as a result of my trip to China, there's a Chinese company here doing for the first time what hasn't been done in this country. Chinese investment, not as contractor building for us like how they built this building. They are now, with the approval of the government of China, the Chinese companies now allowed to invest, take part of the risk, put part of the money in. You get part of the ownership, but then you have a requirement to bring some of your Chinese ships to the dry dock in La Brea. That is now in its final stages, and by April we expect to have some kind of decision to go forward with this project if all the economics pan out. Then, of course, the tourism project, I don't know what that project is going to be. And I tell you today, because I am expecting that we would have chased away what we thought in the government would have been good for us. Throughout the Caribbean, from the Turks and Caicos Island, Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, Grenada, and St. Lucia, all of these islands have huge tourism projects, employing tens of thousands of people and giving their young people serious quality jobs in the tourism sector. The minute you make a mention that one of those projects could be located in Tobago, all hell break loose in those who are opposed to the PNM. And today I'll tell you why. You know why? Because they rather see the country suffer and keep their political prospects in place rather than support us. Tobago is the only place in the Caribbean where somehow a sandals project will bring leprosy. everywhere else. Go and ask them. Grenada, St. Lucia, Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica. In some territories, they have 5. Barbados is now building its 2nd or 3rd, Antigua, St. Lucia, so on. But somehow, voices in this country, pseudo-intellectuals in this country, experts without information, will tell you and tell the people of Tobago that the Sandals brand is bad for Tobago because it wasn't Sandals Hotel. It would have been a government of Trinidad and Tobago hotel managed on the Sandals brand, which would have brought in the airlift that we need and give us the economic engine that we need. But whatever it is, that is an area that the government is focusing on. We are focusing on upgrading our tourism plant in Trinidad and Tobago because tourism is an area in which we can do better. So the government is aiming to do better in there, whatever you call it. The 2 new ferries, I can advise you that I have already signed off at the level of the cabinet. We've paid down the initial monies. The construction is going on. We're buying one from Incat and one from Ostal, and that construction is shaping up to be underway. The San Fernando Waterfront, the cabinet has approved that, and that is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the signboard probably up already, but the San Fernando Waterfront project is a go. The Coast Guard vessels, we've paid the money, and those 2 vessels are now to be constructed. We've paid $40 million in that already, authorizing the yard to begin the construction. And of course, we have an ongoing housing program where all kinds of things are happening, and you'll hear more about that in the near future. But this is what was possible. This is what was done. This is what was done. This is what is being done. And for half of it. If we go to the short-term borrowings, months before the 2015 general election, this is the election date here. Remember I told you, when we looked at the red bars for borrowing, how the borrowing in 2015 had looked small, but we had the peak of the economic activity for 2015 on the previous chart. This is why we were able to do that. Because it was only when we came into government, those who want to know everything now, if the government goes to the toilet, they want to know about the toilet paper. But when they were running the country, right, on the 7th of September, you did not know that the government had borrowed for the EMBD $400 million. They borrowed that money for contracts that they awarded in July of 2015. The contractors were supposed to have finished the job before the election, which was September, and they paid the contractor right up until election Sunday. $400 million was burnt up in that way between July and September. July, August, September. In an 8-week period, this $400 million was borrowed, and it was due to be paid back by July 2017. Right? That's what they borrowed. They borrowed with a repayment for 2 years. But you'll observe, Caribbean Airlines, they eat up in that year $510 million. Borrowed. They borrowed 75 million US for that purpose. Today I can tell you, notwithstanding what they're telling you and telling their friends, Carl had a function here a few weeks ago to announce not this bleeding and borrowing by the Ministry of Finance, but to announce that they were making a profit on their operations. So on their operational account, Caribbean Airlines is making a profit. The National Carnival Commission, another borrowing, $75 million to be repaid in 1 year. Right? Damen, you know, you're hearing now that this government is to account for the scandal of the 2 boats we're building in Australia. Hearing that? But I told you from the day the Australians invited me, I told you I was invited by the Australians to pay a visit to the Australian nation. I met the Australian Prime Minister in London. We met in London and you were told in Trinidad that we were meeting. I told you what the conversation was. The conversation was that I asked the Australian Prime Minister to help us fund something that we couldn't fund. Because if you don't have the money and you have the need, and you can have someone help you fund it, that's what Australia did for us. Now, every day in the Parliament, they want to know this, they want to know that. And of course, what the traitors did here in Trinidad and Tobago, after we got the Australian government to agree to support us and to be the first borrowers of a facility that the Australian government put in place to support the purchase of military equipment. We are about the first borrower on that loan, introduced to us by the Australians. The Trinidad and Tobago opposition communicated with the Australian opposition, trying to ask them to put pressure on the Australian government not to allow that to happen. They were ignored. They were ignored because Australia is a friendly Commonwealth country that Trinidad and Tobago has very close relationship with. When they were ignored with that, they then wrote the Australian Attorney General reporting a non-scandal and a non-crime, but writing in their letter that they in Trinidad and Tobago have reason to believe that this arrangement between the Australian government and the Trinidad and Tobago government, between the Australian Prime Minister and the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, that has some scandal in it. And they're asking the Australian Attorney General to investigate this scandal. He replied to them telling them that the AG office in Australia doesn't investigate scandals. If you have something to complain about, talk to the Australian police. You laugh at that. But you know what they're saying now, having done that bit of treachery? They are now saying in Trinidad and Tobago that the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, is under investigation by the Australian police. Mind your business. Mind your business. So while we were able to be solving two problems as a result of our connection with Australia, one is to get 2 new ferries for the Tobago route, built and funded, and 2 vessels for our Coast Guard, built and funded from borrowings from Australia. Somehow, those who just have to explain to you what they did with $29 billion in cash could see scandal in the cooperation between 2 Commonwealth countries, which is a signal development in the Commonwealth. I can tell you, as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, when I travel to Australia, and I meet the Australian government and their officials and do business for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, it was to the credit and honor of the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the people of Australia. How many of you knew going into the election of 2015 that they had borrowed $1.6 billion for TNTech to be repaid in 6 months? 6 months. $1.6 billion for TNTech. And of course, down here, for the HDC, $300 million to be repaid again in 9 months. And the PTSC, $57 million to be repaid in 3 months. This is a total, in this kind of borrowing, we met this kind of short-term debt, over and above the loss of the revenue we spoke about earlier on, which resulted from the loss of earnings in oil and gas and so on. Over and above all of that, we met this, a package of $4 billion that was available to be repaid immediately or thereabouts. So one of the things that Minister Imbert and the Ministry of Finance and Vishnu Danpal, the PS in Finance, who are doing yeoman service, is to have reorganized all of this debt in such a way that we could manage it as a longer-term debt and not collapse the economy in the process. Because we just could not pay this. But those who were borrowing here on this side of the election, they must have known that it had to be repaid right here. And there's silence in that. Because none of you in this room knew what I just told you. And if you think that was the end of it, over and above these borrowings here for these agencies here, to be repaid in this way, the biggest bed of thorns they left for the government, which is not here, was the back pay for public servants. On the way out of office, they gave public servants a $5 billion back pay. And you would recall, that's a contract, because they agreed to it and signed it. The new government had to pay it. We told the public servants, we can't pay, but we'll try and pay you in 2 tranches. We, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, honoring that contract of that irresponsible government, trying to win an election on a back pay of $5 billion in that situation. We went and we had to borrow $2.5 billion first, and we paid half of the back pay. Remember that? Any public servants in here? Public servants said, I want my money now. I want my money now. We had to go and borrow another $2.5 billion. So we borrowed, because I just showed you the money was not there. When it was being given as a pay increase, the money was not there. But it was a bind for the government, it's a contract. We had to go and borrow and add to the public debt that $5 billion. So when you add all of this to the public debt, and that $5 billion, and all the other borrowings and so on, clearly the country's borrowing level would have gone up. And who was talking about debt level the most in this country? Who was in the forefront talking about the government being irresponsible? So as you mind your business, you get to learn this. This blue note represents all the money that comes into the country, 100% of the money. It's $100, 100%. Let that represent all the money in the budget, the budgeted expenditure. Right? The first thing that happens with that $100, you have to spend $18 paying debt. That's from money you borrow in the past and paying, and including some of what I just mentioned to you there. But we always have some debt to carry. And the debt service is the first call on any money earned by the country. Are you aware of that? Whatever you want to do in the country, whoever you want to fet with, the first money you have to pay is the debt. Because if you don't pay the debt, the country goes bankrupt, and you could do nothing else of any consequence. And those who lent you the money, they lent you the money under the understanding that you will give their repayment highest priority. So public debt payment, $18. Now, the next fixed payment you have to make, wages, salaries, and pensions, that will take $50. So between the debt and wages, salaries, and pensions, $68 gone. Social services of one kind or another, another $9. So $77 gone. Infrastructure, the things that you have to do to build whatever you have to build, whether it's a school or whatever, $10. And of course, everything else that you have to do, whatever you think of, which is not covered here, you have $13 to do that. In countries that have this same kind of profile, that are forced to roll themselves back to what the money could afford, if you don't service here, you are into default. And the IMF comes in just before then as your lender of last resort. There are 2 CARICOM territories now that are under IMF supervision because they have problems here. Those same countries, one of them, in dealing with this payment here, had to cut here. 3,000 workers went home in Barbados. And of course, we have some of the best social services offerings in any country in the Commonwealth. In case you all don't understand that. Things you get in Trinidad and Tobago from the government, you don't get from other governments elsewhere in the world. But you take it for granted. And of course, we have all kinds of expenses up here. National security, Tobago House of Assembly issues, all kinds of things. And after all of that, the conversation in the country could still be, nothing happening, nothing going on, government ain't give me nothing, government ain't doing nothing. The government is not magic. The government is management. Management.
Thank you for viewing Part 1 of the National Report with Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley. Join us tomorrow night at 8 p.m. for Part 2 of the National Report, when the Prime Minister will explain how we are moving Trinidad and Tobago towards a brighter future.